Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. is in conversation with John Cleghorn. John became pastor of Caldwell Presbyterian in 2008 after 25 years in banking and journalism. He has served Caldwell as it rebounded from almost closing to become a vibrant, diverse, mission-driven congregation centered on the love and justice of Jesus Christ. His latest book, Building Belonging, the Church's Call to Create Community and House Our Neighbors, springs from his congregation's experience and his national research into the emerging movement of faith-based organizations building affordable housing on their property. Building Belonging blends theology and Bible study with case studies and lessons learned from the movement. A native of Atlanta, he has lived in Charlotte since 1986 and has served on a wide array of nonprofit agency boards in the religious and human services field at the local and national levels. He is married to Kelly, a kindergarten teacher, and has 2 adult children. He holds a doctorate in ministry from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, a Master of Divinity from Union Presbyterian Seminary, and a Bachelor of Arts from Washington and Lee University. His first book, Resurrecting Church, Where Justice and Diversity Meet Radical Welcome and Healing Hope, came out in 2020. A reminder before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Connect with Loren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. Shoot us an email at loren@resonatemediapro.com with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. We appreciate your voice in how we faithfully discern the future of the church.
Hello and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Loren Richmond Jr., and I am pleased to be welcoming today the Reverend Dr. John Cleghorn. Hello and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Loren. I'm really delighted to be here.
Great. Looking forward to having this conversation. Is there anything else you want to say about yourself? Maybe what part of the country do you come from right now?
Well, I am a lifelong Southerner, and I try to live beyond that, but I was born in Atlanta, have lived my adult life in Charlotte, have been all over the country, but native of this area and very aware of the South's pros and cons.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for being here. Looking forward to talking more. Share, if you would, just about your faith journey, what that's looked like in the past and what that looks like today.
Well, thank you. It's been an adventure, to say the least, and one I'm very grateful for. I grew up in Atlanta in a reasonably affluent, moderate to progressive church that really, to me, as a kid and then as a teenager, I was not aware of those kinds of labels. To me, it was a community. It was a family that embraced me, and single mother, and was there every Sunday. My mother was very involved, and I became very involved as a youth elder. And so it had a profound influence on shaping me and probably planting seeds that later sprouted in terms of my own sense of call. But of course, by the time I got into ministry in my 40s, the punch bowl that had been the largesse and the mainstream Christianity was not there anymore. So it's been a fun ride to adapt and adjust. But I'm very much a cradle Presbyterian and thankful for that.
Yeah. Share, if you would, a spiritual practice that's meaningful for you.
Well, thank you. Right now, I'm trying to focus very much on living into my finiteness. I'm reading a book called Meditations for Mortals that I heard about, and it embraces the fact that a lot of us as activists and advocates live in trying to overdo and therefore not get as much done and run ourselves ragged. So I'm at the phase in my career where I'm trying to very much concentrate on living a robust life that is not uninformed by limitations.
That's sounds very wise and prudent. I know that's a struggle as just as I look to my parents, thinking about how they, perhaps not as well as I'd like them to, think about their own limitations in life, and as they near the end of their working ages and careers.
Well, part of it here is that this congregation is so passionate about so many different things. And so my journey in that regard is the church's journey, in that the church takes on very big, audacious things. And but we can't. We've got to figure out how to run the race at a pace where we can finish.
Yeah, that's smart. Well, I'm excited to have this conversation. John is the author of the book, Building Belonging, the Church's Call to Create Community and House Our Neighbors. So maybe if you want to begin just by, as you do in the book, kind of just telling the story of your congregation and then how the book came about through that.
Absolutely. Thanks. Indeed, this church went through sort of a near-death experience, and then rebounded, and has come back to life as a diverse and missional and intersectional church. And early on in its resurrected life, we have a campus that once housed a congregation of 1,100 members. And so we are blessed with a lot of space and have tried to use that very missionally and creatively. And for 3.5 years, housed a women's shelter in one of our buildings. And at about that time that it moved on to a more permanent, suitable site, we were a stopgap site. But we also, as a church, were celebrating our centennial, and the congregation slowed down and had the audacity, just having been kind of brought back from the grave, to say, what shall we do with our second century? And we looked at a variety of big ideas, middle ideas, small ideas, but the one that resonated was that we had missed having the women in the shelter. And so we took a good hard look at a 14,000 square foot building. Every church has one, the big Sunday school wing with lots of classrooms, and decided to, in fact, go long on housing and dedicate that to helping address the affordable housing crisis. Now, that was 10, 11 years ago, and it's gotten so much more acute. But the book comes out of, in part, our journey, in part mine interest as a former reporter to understand the national emergence of this movement and to trace it, which I used a sabbatical for, and then to try and capture the movement early on as it is, to share with other churches that might be thinking about this same calling. And the movement has really just skyrocketed. My book focuses particularly on churches that look at putting housing on their property. There are many ways for churches to be involved in the housing crisis. My book is the first kind of case study, set of case studies to look at different ways that churches have done that so far. And ever since then, I learn of yet more examples. So it's been a fascinating movement in its infancy to try and kind of document.
Yeah, I'm curious if you can kind of share about, I mean, I think it's been well documented, but just to summarize about kind of the housing crisis writ large. I mean, it seems like every time we think it can't get worse, things can get worse. So how have you seen that play out And how has that impacted your ministry and your congregation's kind of missional impact or missional motives?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a strange kind of convergence and weave of, I guess, my own personal journey with that subject. In the 80s, I was a business reporter for the newspaper here, and I covered housing, and then found myself being drawn more into direct community work and was involved in some of the earliest affordable housing dialogues here in Charlotte, when relative to the problem we have now was hardly anything. But found myself being interested in that, 35 years ago. And then, as you have pointed out, it's just become a kitchen table topic now. It wasn't necessarily 45 years ago. And so as we leaned into understanding that Charlotte had a budding crisis, the nation's crisis also sort of blossomed in all the wrong ways, all the way to the point that in last year's presidential election, the first time that I can remember, both candidates were talking about a housing crisis in their stump speeches. And so it touches every county and every burb in America, whether it's urban or rural. People making minimum wage or even a basic livable wage cannot afford decent housing in America. And so Charlotte has become my second home, and I have a kind of a passionate relationship with Charlotte. I love it, but I want it to do better. And it resembles a lot of cities in that it's economically very successful and growing, one of the fastest growing cities in America. But it loves to say, our boosters love to say that we welcome 140 people a day to Charlotte. What we don't talk about is how many people we're pricing out of Charlotte, and those tend to be the people that do the hard work in our city. So I've sort of followed it both as a citizen and a civic participant, but now also as a pastor with a congregation of folks that includes millionaires, but also people that have been on the streets.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing about your book, and you're certainly not the only person to have spoke to this trend or written about this trend. Mark Elsden and others have made great points about this coming transition in church real estate, church property. What do you want to say just to this precipice? I'm not even sure the word, the correct, disastrous word to say about how you're seeing this trend, maybe in your own community, how you're seeing this nationwide.
Well, thanks. Yeah, my journey with that topic, that answer has evolved. It's interesting. I think fundamentally we all recognize that at the height of Christendom, in the middle part of the last century, when Christianity was at the center of American life, post-war boom into the 60s and 70s and 80s, churches built big, ample campuses. And it wasn't glibly as easy as opening your door and people would come, but Christianity was very much in the mainstream. And but now everything is different, and Christianity is much more on the margins in America, depending on which stripe you practice. And now so many churches have aging, very large but very well situated physical campuses. And my evolution on that has come around to realize that I think it's a tough topic for a lot of traditional church people to grasp, that we have to change our relationship with real estate and property because we're so bound up with our buildings. We can remember that favorite baptism or that favorite sonata, or the fellowship hall where we had so many meals, or the playground in the back, or the softball field that nobody has used in years, but we still like to have a softball field. And this now puts churches in a very different position. We simply will not probably ever in our lifetimes, again, fill up our parking lots and our pews as we did last century. That doesn't mean the church is dying. It just means the church is changing. And so churches have an opportunity to rethink their relationship with property, either out of their own future sustenance planning, but hopefully also with a mission involved. And that opens up, once you get comfortable with that conversation, that can open up some very exciting conversations and even new life in a church once they realize that their properties are no longer just liabilities that constantly need repair, but are assets that can be transformed.
Right. I think it's interesting when we think about, you kind of talk about that needing of a change of relationship between real estate and property, or a change of understanding. In your book, you talk about the unique role the pastor has in casting vision. And so I want you to speak to that, but I'm also curious when we think about kind of that transformative, or helping people grieve that loss of relationship or loss of the past. You mentioned like the fellowship hall where someone might have had big events, the softball fields, the baptismals. How do you help pastors lead their congregations through that grieving process?
I guess in a word, respectfully. It's not an easy job. People's emotions get so tied up in church buildings that you have to really slow walk that conversation. Even if a pastor becomes convinced that perhaps financially it's not sustainable to maintain buildings as they are, sometimes the numbers can be pretty compelling. So one way that pastors can do that is simply share the numbers. And so many churches are looking at bank accounts that they can count the months until they're depleted.
Right.
Or if they, maybe that's not the immediacy of the case for another church. But if they look honestly at their mission dollars versus their property upkeep dollars, it's upside down. And so the dollars can make an argument. But at the end of the day, it's the gospel that can set us free on that. It was a rare time in American Christianity when we built all these campuses and come around to understanding that that's not the only way to be church, and that for hundreds and hundreds of years, that was not the way Christians were embodied in the world. And then, as so many churches in the book told me, there really can be liberation beyond the current conversation of, well, how are we going to fix the roof, and how are we going to fix the organ, and can we get a daycare in here to pay the bills? All those very they're almost captive conversations that tie us to our real estate in a way, rather than liberating us to say, what if? But mourning has to come early on, and then the liberation can come. And it's very much an Easter story. We have to die to our old selves to be reborn again. And the book is full of examples of churches that have found that liberation of, when they reimagine their real estate, they can focus on serving their neighbor in a way that they hadn't, and that can be a great joy.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about that, again, that pastoral process of shepherding a congregation. In your experience in listening to congregations and doing it yourself, do you feel like it's kind of I hate to say step by step, because we know processes and growth and change is never like linear, right? It's never, you're done with the morning, now it's time for the vision. But what have you found that, or have you heard that it's really important to allow space and time for mourning, grieving before you can cast a vision? Or can you cast some vision, allow space for, is there, I hate to say again, process, but what have you seen that works?
I've seen pastors that are nothing short of heroic. In the book, Ashley Goff at Arlington Presbyterian talks about, leading her congregation through that, and her predecessor who laid the groundwork. I think you're asking a great question of what is that balance between the grieving process, and it really is that the stages of grief are universal. They are not necessarily sequential, but all of those emotions are involved. But it is, I think, the role of a leader to cast a vision to help people see something beyond the buildings as they have become in many cases, which is just a burden. So it's both and, I think, Loren, that the gospel gives us a vision, and the gospel lays out, as I recount in the book, a very clear idea about what God's vision for land and property are. And that is for the common good. And so one of the things that pastors can do is remind people, both theologically and biblically, of how God looks at economy and how God looks at land and property. So if people are having a hard time letting go of the property, sometimes the tough job of the pastor is to say, well, folks, maybe we lost sight when everything was so abundant, and relatively easier than it is today to be a church. Maybe that anomaly was just that, and so it depends on the congregation and the setting, but it's part theological, part biblical, part emotional, part pastoral care, holding the hand of folks, and then partly bold prophetic leadership to say maybe God's perspective has something different in mind. And then if folks can catch the light of that, then they can really be excited.
That's great. That's great. I want to transition this a little bit to thinking outside the congregation. And as I've studied, development, even broadly speaking, on a small scale, one of the essential steps, as I understand it, in land development is working, or at least connecting with the neighbors, if only for a good PR, right? I'm thinking about this in the church context, and I want to hear your perspective here, that I think, for good reason, affordable housing is becoming a really big thing that a lot of churches are going after for good reason, but also speak to the necessity and the importance of, again, connecting with the neighbors, connecting with the community, and why that's essential.
Well, I like your choice of words there, Loren. Essential. It is the essence of a church to be connected to its community, but we can all lose sight of that sometimes. Location, church and place has changed over time. And so maybe an inner city church has its members driving in from suburbs because they moved out. And therefore they're driving past the most immediate neighbors and neighborhoods surrounding the proximity of the church, or the church has been so busy being internally focused that it is only partially or selectively really in touch with its immediate neighborhood. Again, coming out of that season of abundance, when we could build churches that provided lots of programs for our members and didn't have to necessarily be in touch with our neighbors. So it can lead to a beautiful reintroduction to neighborhoods. And yes, it is smart from a community relations to understand that, but it's vastly much more and primarily missional. It can, if a congregation says, let's go out and talk to our neighbors and what they need and what we might be able to provide and how that might fuel a reimagining of our property. Again, that recenters a congregation on mission, not just paying the bills and, the other things that sometimes churches get distracted with. And that really is the most important. The first point I think I would make is, there's all sorts of reasons for churches to look at reimagining their property, including monetization of it that can help financially the church sustain itself. But without mission, first, second, and third, and central at all times, without that, the churches probably ought to think hard about whether or not to reimagine their property and redevelop their property. The mission piece has to come first. And to your point, Loren, that's tied to the neighborhood. That's not always easy. It can introduce, differences in class and race and walk of life. But again, that can reground the church if it so desires in serving neighbor.
I'm so glad you made that point about mission over monetization, first of all. Second of all, am I remembering correctly? I think this was in your book. You tell stories about churches who are thinking like, oh, let's do senior housing. And then they talk to the community and they're like, oh, I guess there's not a need for senior housing. So again, the importance of connecting with the neighborhood.
That's right. One of the case studies that I came across was a church that had an idea that wasn't rooted in community demand. And so they got so far down the road in a vision that then they found out that really didn't fit what the community needed. The opposite example that I think is just remarkable, and therefore it's taking a very long time to evolve, but Westminster Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. is not far from the Potomac, not far from the Capitol, gentrifying neighborhood, and they're reimagining, scraping their entire in almost city block-sized campus to come back with housing, but more importantly, recording studios and other things that will help the youth in the most immediate surrounding streets and blocks, find something to do during the day, in the afternoons and the evenings. So, Westminster's vision will come back. Maybe not at all like people think of as a church. There won't be some big tall steeple and some big parking lot. But they will have built what their neighbors asked for and need. And what Brian Hamilton, the pastor of Westminster, says is, by getting those, teens off the streets, they literally will be saving lives. And what better testimony for a church? So, but that can take so many forms. It could be a coffee shop. It could be different kinds of housing. It could be mixed income housing. It could be, churches have always been community centers. And so hopefully churches can continue to find ways to, be the place where the AA and the NA meetings come. But, congregations can figure out how to reconfigure themselves alongside and maybe even around the needs of the neighborhood. Arlington Presbyterian Church, tore itself down, built a multi-story affordable housing project, and then leased space back from itself, in effect, because it doesn't know how long their church is going to be viable. And I thought that was remarkably faithful to say our land can be used for the common good, and all we need is a few, a fraction of the space we need. And we're not even going to make it permanent. Let's see how long we need this space. But what we know is we built something the community is using now. And I've seen many, many examples of that where it's selfless and Christ-like in that regard.
I mean, that does really speak to what you said, I think, at the top about your own congregation's near-death experience and experiencing now a resurrected life. I mean, I hate to say it's as simple as that, but is that really what it comes down to? Like, congregations have to be willing to die? I mean, this is right the core of the Christian message, I think, in some regard, right?
Easier said than done, yes, but I believe so. Now, that's much easier for me to say because this church did go through a resurrection that was highly unlikely and a bit like lightning striking. So I can't say it was formulaic, easy peasy, follow these 3 easy steps and your church will be resurrected. But yes, there's a fundamental theological truth that when you put one foot in the tomb and you get a good look, at what death, so to speak, looks like, it can be a very liberating experience. And, at that point, it can reframe your imagination in a way to take risks, which is not a phrase that churches like to use. But the shoe is on the other foot, to use a terrible cliche.
Yeah.
We are not in the majority. We are not in the largesse anymore. A handful of churches may have big endowments and may be good for another 10 or 20 years without having to work terribly hard. But that is the exception. But what we have is land and property, and in that, possibility.
Yeah. I want to transition this a little bit from the local congregational level to a more denominational or big church level, because you talk about, let me find the direct quote here. You write that in general, denominational leaders are not well equipped unto themselves to advise congregations about possibilities for the campuses in mission, nor are they well positioned to manage their own growing real estate and financial portfolios with courageous missional imagination for the benefit of those in need of housing. So I guess, A, I'm kind of curious, about that quote, and then B, I've had a denominational leader say to me, we're not in the property management business, so to speak. And I'm wondering, should we rethink that to be more in the property management business? Does that make sense?
Well, it does make sense. And you're right. It's not an easy, dilemma that can be solved, but it's just flat out true. Baptists, free churches obviously are unto themselves, and they make whatever decisions they want about their individual piece of property. But the traditional Protestant denominations, Presbyterian, Lutheran,
Methodist, certainly.
And then even Episcopalian churches and hierarchical ecclesiastical structures, they too are sitting on lots and lots of land. And I found in my research that they're all waking up to this need, that there's real possibility here, and how, very understandably, when I said denominations are ill-equipped to handle it, that's not a slight. Denominations are focused on so many other things. Real estate development, and nonprofit work, social work is incredibly complex. And it's not what we've been training pastors or ecclesiastical leaders to learn how to do. But I can look at Charlotte, as a microcosm example. Charlotte, North Carolina, in our presbytery, which is a 7-county presbytery, but it's largely urban Charlotte, metro Charlotte. Second largest concentration of Presbyterians in the United States. One of the most thriving collections of Presbyterian congregations. But as Presbyterianism, the PCUSA has consolidated, let's say, so has the local church. In our region. And we have gone in the last 15 years from being at an inflection point in our own staffing as a presbytery staff. This presbytery made a bet on the next big piece of land that it thought it could just plant a church in, and it got caught in the Great Recession in 2008, lost a great deal of money, almost bankrupt the presbytery, but simply through church closings. Ever since then, the presbytery has $8 or $9 million in the bank, and another 10 or 20 churches that probably, are looking at very existential questions in the immediate future. And so whether or not denominations want to be in the land business, they're going to be. Land is defaulting back to denominations as churches consolidate. And you pick your prediction, 1 in 3, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 congregations is going to close in the next 10 to 15 years. That's drastically transformative. And so I do believe that churches have a lot to learn, denominations have a lot to learn, and are going to be in the land business, or are already in the land business, and will be increasingly in the land business, whether or not they want to be or are prepared.
Yeah. again, this is kind of a hard question, so feel free to tread lightly as you'd like to. But I'm wondering, at least from how I've seen it sometimes, is there almost a perverse incentive, to use kind of an economic word, for denominations to just sell properties just to kind of maintain the institution, to kind of like slow the decline of the institution, rather than do the hard work of kind of investing properties for these kind of social good topics like affordable housing? Because again, it's much easier just to offload a property to a developer for luxury condos than it is to go through like the LIHTC tech and all the complicated capital stack that you got to do for developing affordable housing.
Sounds like you've done a couple of deals yourself when you go into those kinds of abbreviated LIHTC and everything, but capital stacks, you speak the language. I think there is a tension, and I'm going to choose to call it a creative tension.
Yeah, it's
potential conflict.
prudent words.
I think that the risk is that local adjudicatories will realize that there are, millions at close range for a developer to come along and say, I will take this property off your hands.
Mm-hmm.
Or congregations to lean into that. But maybe flat out, real estate transactions are legitimate if they're part of a larger rebirth and transformation of mission.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing wrong with money if you use it for good. And
right.
So, but again, I think you hit the nail on the head. These deals are complex. My study found that they take, 3 to 5 to 7 years on average to develop. Many congregations are already on their last breath, or maybe not that, but they don't know the first thing about real estate and housing and social need. So it's a tall order, and it's not for everybody to enter into these deals. I pray that denominational leadership, and I see it, are working really hard to catch up fast to equip congregations to help them slow down and not panic. You mentioned Mark Elsden's book, Gone for Good. I completely endorse it. It's an excellent how-to book. It sits alongside my book, which has case studies and biblical and theological, as well as lessons learned. And I think there are other books, in the offing. There are developers, in states that have the most acute housing crises that are learning to speak church. And that's critical for them to understand that churches sometimes and denominations sometimes move slowly.
Yeah.
So these deals are very complex, and they can be utterly exhausting. Ours has been amazing and exhausting. We're weeks out from welcoming our neighbors onto our campus, but there have been many times when we were just about spent, having faced the next hurdle, much less a pandemic.
Yeah.
But so yes, there's a conflict that denominations are going to have to learn very quickly, and I think can obtain the expertise they need.
Mm-hmm.
But to bring that in-house or find it very close at hand, and then developers to learn how to speak church and work with congregations so that they know it's not a quick turnaround, but amazing things can happen and are happening around the country in all kinds of housing and property transformation examples.
Yeah, and as we're talking here, I'm looking on Google Maps of your own congregation, Caldwell Presbyterian. It's funny enough that with Google Maps, I can kind of look on different time periods and see the old Belk Hall, and now what's the new building here called?
Hope Hall. That's right.
Hope Hall.
Yeah.
Yeah. So beautiful a beautiful new construction that is going to house folks. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Actually, that's a different building. But yeah, we've been able to transform our property in multiple ways. But there's a long building that runs down one side of the property if you're looking at it on Google Earth, and that's the old education wing, and that's the one that we're gutting and turning into 21 studio apartments.
Wow. So to summarize, if I can, I'm thinking again just about denominational leadership. And of course, like you mentioned, this kind of depends based on the polity of the denomination, the church tradition. But it really sounds like, just from your own experience, that discernment and helping people discern is really like the most essential step.
You're right, Loren. Without a clear commitment to a missional cause and vision that is compelling to the congregation, compelling enough to help them hang in there through the
7 years,
the highs and lows and the frustrations and the joys of it. But in that is rebirth, and in that is kind of this is a pretentious way to think about it, but almost a purification of what churches can be and do about. And, certainly congregations have to maintain a focus on taking care of their own flock. There's no question about that. But at the same time, there's new life in shedding our old skin and turning to neighbor, and in walking with them, we can be reborn. The movement is still early. It'll be interesting to see how it pans out. I don't suggest this undertaking for everybody, but for those churches that catch the vision and really can commit to a new missional purpose, it can be resurrecting. Yeah.
Well, the book is Building Belonging. The Church's Call to Create Community and to House Our Neighbors. Recommend the book. And sure enough, he has a blurb recommendation on the back of the book from Mark Elsden. So thank you so much. Let's take a quick break here and come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Reverend Dr. John Cleghorn. So really appreciate the conversation. These closing questions, we always tell folks you can take them as seriously or not as you'd like to. That being said, I do want to kind of ask a real estate type question, because with this Pope question, again, some people take this more seriously than others. Some people want to sell all the land. If you had, significant control, let's say, over Catholic or another humongous church denomination's real estate per se, what would one thing you'd want to accomplish with that real estate in a day? And if you want to just answer the Pope question too, that's okay.
Well, I suppose I'll just step right into it. I would love in 50 years to come back. I won't be here, but to come back and see church properties that aren't recognizably church properties, but that still has a congregation, but have all kinds of things that reflect the needs and the wants and the lives and the hopes and the dreams of their neighbors and their neighborhoods and their cities. One interesting thing about this is that city governments, local county governments, are really catching this wave and leaning into how to equip churches to do this. So if I were Pope, I might make it different. I might make it mayor or governor.
Sure.
California has passed a bill that allows churches to develop their property by right. That is, if they're doing something for the community and the common good, they don't have to go through zoning laws. I would love to see that kind of bill flourish everywhere. I would love for cities to understand and simplify zoning. We can build our way out of this housing crisis. It's going to take a lot, but along the way, we're not just building housing, but we can build communities by bringing back diversity of race and class and life experience into the neighborhoods that are now so highly segregated.
Yes. I should say, as we're recording this, Yigby is, yes, in God's backyard, as was it California, is also working through the process in my neck of the woods in Colorado. So if you're listening to this in Colorado, I can't remember when this will come out, but say a word to your state representative to try to support that. Because I was just at a meeting, a couple weeks, months, I can't remember ago, and they, there's a testimony from a church, and they talked about how much money they spent just on the rezoning, how much effort, how tedious that process was alone just on the rezoning. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
That's great for Colorado. There's some fabulous examples in Denver, and I'm delighted to hear that bill is advancing there. I've got a friend who's writing a bill like that in North Carolina right now. So we're years away, but I'm delighted to hear that for.
I want to ask, and I'm going off script here. I want to ask, because I think I meant to ask this when the denominational question too. A lot of my affordable housing experience comes in a type of social work context. And I'm curious, do we as denominations, as seminaries, the institution need to rethink in some regard, the role of pastor and church as more of a kind of social work model? And again, I'm someone who believes strongly in the gathered community of worship and discipleship, but could we rethink our churches, even church plants, let's say, as more of a really communal model? Do you think there's opportunity for that?
I think there's great opportunity for that. For a young person to be going into ministry now, they better understand that, their father's church and their grandfather's church, or their mother's church and their grandmother's church are increasingly rare. And so live into the chance to be a different kind of a pastor, including social work, including community organizing. That's a direction that I think the body of Christ can flourish in, as it has in past eras. But absolutely. And we have tried to prepare our congregation for years now to understand what it's going to be like to have 21 folks who are chronically homeless move onto our campus, and how do we understand their walks of life? So it's not just pastors. It can be members too. But yes, I would love to see seminaries and others prepare churches just as intently for community work as we do understanding Barth and Calvin and doctrine and politics.
Yeah. Speaking of dead theologians, do you have a dead theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
I guess there are three. You got to go with Jesus.
Sure.
We're all trying to understand, who the historical Jesus was. These days, I'd love to have Bonhoeffer come back to life and speak to America. But I'm also very intrigued with Paul. If you read the depth of and breadth of his work, there are some things that I know some people categorize as bashing types of scriptures. But then you read Galatians 3:26, 27, 28, and he says, in Christ there's neither male nor female, slave nor free, Greek nor Jew. And you think about that kind of intersectional inclusivity in the church. And I want to know Paul. He was a fascinating guy, and like Jesus, I think we just have kind of gray outlines of who Paul really was, and so I'm curious.
Yeah. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Some people would say, we're following the arc of Rome and nearing America's unhappy ending. I believe too much in hope. I have to hope that America will still wake up and shake off its lethargy and acceptance of the profound class differences we have, and refocus on the common good, and pray that we can do that in a way that is transformative and nonviolent.
To that point, then, and I suppose you shared some of it right there, but what are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
That it can be transformed, and I think it's happening. It's throwing off its shell of the last century when we were in a very different circumstance. I see churches and pastors, and to your point, community organizers and social workers doing remarkable things that to me look much more like what Jesus did day to day than perhaps when the church was much more closely aligned with empire and capitalism.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Do you want to tell folks how they can connect with you, get the book, any of that?
Well, gosh, thank you. I suppose the easiest thing to do is Google me. There's a former Canadian banker that has my name, but other than that, I'm one of the few John Cleghorns out in Google land. I have another book that came out just a few years ago as well called Resurrecting Church, and it looks at the history of some of the diverse churches in the PCUSA and how they're resurrecting through diversity. I truly am delighted to be in touch with anyone that would like to reach out, and I would welcome that chance and know that I still have a lot to learn. I'm a straight, white, highly educated, affluent, older white guy, so there's a lot I can learn from other folks.
Well, I really appreciate the time and the conversation. Always leave folks with a word of peace, so may God's peace be with you.
And also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.